details are on the ACM conference website. So we'll hear first from Gail Karish, and she will talk about strategies for handling future renewals, especially now because in the last few minutes the FCC has issued its order in the second further notice of proposed rulemaking, or what in Eugene I refer to as the cable in kind, franchise fee offset, and attack on Eugene. On page 48, on our right-of-way use fees, with internet access providers involving a case against Comcast, which they lost at the Oregon Supreme Court a couple of years ago. After that, we will hear from Tom Robertson about some look back at franchise renewal strategies over the past few years. Then we'll hear from Sue Buskey about building strategic partnerships with local governments. So the panelists are looking forward to an interactive session, and they welcome your questions as they arise. But each panelist will have about half an hour, so if you happen to go over, I will be waving my watch at the panelists so we don't cut the next panelist out. I am also a member of the American Public Works Association because I do get involved in right-of-way utilities disputes and utility location work and installs. So I have a few freebies left from our Dig Once program in Oregon, or Call 811 Before You Dig program, and you can pick a couple of things up at the front whenever you want. Thank you, Neil.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So I had a handout, but it kind of got blown up, so I didn't distribute anything, I'm going to spend my time talking about what everyone's thinking about right now. What does this draft order say? And let me just remind you, this is a draft order. It can change a little bit, so it's not the final that they're going to vote on, and they may or may not vote on it on August 1st. They have it on their agenda for August 1st, but they have a pretty packed agenda, so they might not get to it. We'll see. But let me just go through. My phone will stop ringing. Let me just go through some of the highlights, and I'm going to start, or highlights, lowlights, I don't know, summary, I don't know what to call them. And I'm going to start with the thing that I think everyone in this room was most concerned about based on the policy session yesterday and that whole discussion about channel capacity and how are they going to value it and what's going to happen. And let me just read you a paragraph 53, that I personally call the "we didn't blow up PEG" paragraph. So they said, some commenters have suggested that the proposals in the second FN NPRM threaten to eliminate or drastically reduce PEG programming. We disagree. Significantly, any adverse impact of our ruling on PEG programming should be mitigated by, 1, the expansion of the capital cost exclusion beyond merely capital costs associated with construction, and 2, our decision to defer ruling on whether the cost of channel capacity may be counted under this exclusion. Under the interpretation adopted, provide support where an LFA chooses, but some aspects of that support will now be properly counted against the statutory 5% franchise fee cap, as Congress intended. We recognize that this represents a departure from the longstanding treatment of PEG costs by LFAs and cable operators. We do not, however, believe that these conclusions will eliminate PEG programming, nor do we believe that the existing practice was lawful merely because it was longstanding. The Commission's duty is to conform its rules to law, not tradition. So, the expansion of capital costs, which I'll get into a little bit more, and their decision to defer ruling on whether the cost of channel capacity may be counted under this exclusion. So the channel capacity issue was the one that people were very worried about yesterday, and rightly so. What they've done is they've said, yes, channel capacity is a cable-related item that can be credited against franchise fees, right? But there is an exclusion in the act for capital costs, which they broadened, and they said, we don't know where to put PEG channel capacity, whether it should go in that exclusion or not. And because we're uncertain, and this is a complex issue, and I'll read you another paragraph about it, we're just gonna punt. So they didn't blow up PEG. They blew up a lot of other things, and depending on whether you're in a state, franchise state, or in a state that still has local cable franchising, this order will have big impacts, potentially. Okay, so I said they had a broader definition of capital costs. I'll give you paragraph references when you're reading the order, pay attention. Paragraphs 33 to 36, and well, really 33 to 38, is where they're discussing capital costs. And there, the issue that was primarily of concern was that they had suggested that they were going to have a very limited interpretation of capital costs, that it was only going to be like cost of construction of PEG facilities. And they said in this order, this draft order, no, that was too limited. We're going to be broader than that. It was overly narrow, and that they should be including in capital costs things such as, and I'm trying to find where that was.
It's vans, cameras.
Yeah, where was that? Vans, cameras.
Vans, cameras.
Any long-term assets, either tangible or intangible, land, buildings, patents, franchises. Where was the vans one? 38? Capital costs, here it is, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's a 38.
Yes, it's not limited to costs incurred or associated with the construction of PEG access facilities. Capital costs include construction-related costs. They are not limited to such costs. The ordinary meaning of capital assets is what they use, so it can be a van or a camera. They point to some of the legislative history that talks about vans, studios, cameras, other equipment related to the use of PEG channel capacity. So they've expanded the exclusion. They also have said that PEG transport, so that's from the where the PEG programming is produced to the cable head end, that's also not to be set off against franchise fees.
What maintenance is it?
Yeah, well, it's not capital.
That's right.
Right. Right. On channel capacity, they say they find that the questions raised by channel capacity are complex and the record is not developed enough to allow us to answer them. We therefore defer this issue for further consideration, but they don't actually have a further notice of proposed rulemaking, that they defer the issue for further consideration. In the meantime, we find that the status quo should be maintained and that channel capacity costs should not be offset against the franchise fee cap. This approach will minimize disruption and provide predictability to both local franchise authorities and cable operators. Yay. Go team. Okay, so, yes. So remember, this is a draft. So send in a letter saying, yay, that's right. PEG transport I mentioned.
With the drops. So they're
Okay, so another one, oh, I read that one, that was the 50. INETs did not fare so well. INETs are considered something that could be a set-off, and they say that there is no statutory basis for concluding that there would be any limitation or there would be any exclusion, that the exclusion that relates to capital costs relates to PEG capital costs, not INETs. Build-out, there was some discussion in the rulemaking that cost of build-out obligation should count against franchise fees. They said no. I'll come to valuation in a minute. The free cable service, if you get free cable drops to municipal buildings, they said that should count towards franchise fees. And what you see in things like iNets and cable service drops or free cable service, those are the kinds of things, if you look at some of the state laws, it's very similar to the structure that state laws impose.
Let me just do this. For instance, like if you're in California, we lost those things when our state franchise rules went into effect under DIFCA, the Digital Infrastructure and Video Competition Act. So as Gail's pointing out, it's in California, the iNet issue, as it's in this draft order, and the free drops to schools, et cetera, we lost those, went to state franchising in 2006. Yeah, until they were lost when the state franchise kicked in, whenever that might have been. A number of other states have the same kind of thing. So you're going to have to look at this draft also with relationship to if you're in a state franchising state, whether it's like, for instance, in some states, and broadly speaking, this broadened definition of capital is actually helpful to us. Okay, so there's a lot of different implications to some of these sections as you read them and look at them in context.
So on those items that I mentioned that would now not be excluded or would count against franchise fees potentially, a couple things to point out. One is in paragraph 60, that's where they discuss how the or 60 to 62 really, how the valuation should be, and they do say that it should be a fair market value. And so that is confirming the approach that they had taken before and proposed. And that very much like how we saw, like with iNets, for example, when we lost iNets in California because of the state law, the carriers would, or the cable operators would come and say, yeah, you know that iNet that we built that maybe you paid for part of it and all of that? Well, now this is now we'd like to treat it as a, like a service, and, you know, this is how much we would charge you yearly for it. So that'd be the kind of thing you might see. And we might actually have some benchmarks for what they might charge for that.
And let me throw this out, because I'm not sure anybody who's read through this in the last hour and a half has an answer to it. But one of the things I caught was there was an issue with regard to valuation if the company couldn't double dip on it. So the question that, in my mind, that I'm unclear about right now, okay, is that double dipping issue as it relates to the iNet, if it was negotiated as part of your franchise agreement, and you've got it embedded in the cost that it's being paid by subscribers. I haven't gotten into depth in the double dipping piece, but there is specifically language that FCC used the word, the cable operators can't double dip.
Right.
But we haven't had time to really look at that thoroughly yet.
So then, so we have these sort of pronouncements about what's in, what's out, fair market value, things like that. And our panel is on renewals, but what the FCC says about how those might apply is that they could apply today to an existing franchise. If you just negotiate a renewal, you're not out of the woods. What they will do, though, is they pointed to the process that should be followed if a cable operator wants to challenge an existing franchise requirement based on this rule. this proposed order, and that is discussed in section 60, paragraph 65. So they don't just say, this is all preempted, right? They say, well, I'll read what they say. We realize that cable operators and LFAs may have disagreements about which provisions of an existing franchise agreement are superseded in light of our decision today, or how to modify an existing agreement to bring it into compliance with this order. In those cases, a set process for franchise modification seems appropriate. NCTA proposed process that actually the FCC rejected. And they said, we prefer the City Coalition's proposal that cable operators and LFAs implement our guidance via the existing franchise modification process set forth in Section 625 of the Act. Under those procedures, after the effective date of this order, a cable operator may request modification of the franchise agreement to conform with this order, and the LFA will have 120 days to make a final decision about the cable operator's request. If the LFA rejects the cable operator's request or disputes the value that the cable operator assigns to an in-kind contribution, the cable operator may bring suit in a state court or federal district court that has jurisdiction over the parties. Because this process is rooted in the Act, we believe that it best aligns with congressional intent on how to implement franchise changes resulting from Commission guidance. So there will be, you don't have to expect that they will you'll suddenly get a franchise fee payment with a big reduction, right? Which was one of the things that people were talking about yesterday, were some concern about. It's not supposed to work that way. They're supposed to give you a notice, you evaluate it, make a decision. If you can't resolve it, you may be sued. So that's on the cost side. On the mixed use.
I got a question.
Oh, sorry.
I had a question about that particular.
Okay.
And I know you just got it, so just further into it. Does that seem like their intent then is to actually send out their lawyers to say, we're going to change your agreement? I mean, to all these cities across the country? And say, that's not the intent of that?
I think they're leaving it to the discretion of the cable operators. And we saw that another time when they did something like that very recently is in the small cell order, where if you already had an agreement, you are a city, your streetlights you've made available to carriers for putting wireless facilities, and you negotiated some rate, right? They didn't blow up the rate. They said, we'll just sort of leave it to you to figure out. And the actual experience has been, most of the time, the carriers haven't come back and said, we want to reopen it. But this, I think, is a little different situation because there are benefits that in-kind benefits that the cable operators, because of state video franchising, are not making in some jurisdictions and are making in others. And I think that they will want to at least work on those ones.
But it's more likely that at the end of a franchise, at the next renewal, that's when they might.
Maybe or maybe not. This allows them to do it at any time.
Yeah, and basically, they refer to section 625 in the Act, which is the section's been in the Act, that basically talks about how a cable operator can modify an existing franchise agreement, okay? So they actually refer to that process, which was actually suggested by the LFA Coalition.
Right.
If this is going to happen, then we need a procedure, and that procedure seems to work for us. So if you really, I mean, and a number of us, maybe I know most of us here at this table have gone through that at some point in the past when an incumbent operator wanted to change something that was in an existing franchise. So they had to come in, say what they wanted to change, why they wanted to change it, what the justification was for changing it, and then this LFA's got 120 days, think, and then there's a decision rendered, and then sometimes there used to be at least, well, we'll talk about it and work something out, but that may not be as much talking about it and working it out as there used to be, but that's essentially the process that's in the Act now that they're sort of pointing at.
Right. Right. So the good news, I think, is really related to that they're signaling that it would be inappropriate for a cable operator to just do all the little valuation in their heads and send you a check for like half of what you'd be expecting. So that's good. It's prospective from now, from when the rules go into effect. Yeah,
There's a couple of hands here.
sure.
Say that louder.
Renewal negotiations, the 3-year window.
So the question was, what if you're in renewal or you're in that 3-year window? So you have an existing agreement that they may send you a notice on, or they may just, because you're so close to renewal, just deal with it in the renewal, right?
I got one more.
So hearing kind of these changes, I might be a little bit naive, but it seems like it might not be as nefarious as once thought. It seems like they kind of want to make sure that money is going to things that they wanted it to go to. You know, not putting it into general funds or whatever that. It seems like they wanted to have more control over that part of it and not necessarily rob pegs of franchise fees. After seeing that, does that seem, am I naive or is that?
I think the way I would interpret it is they thought, well, there was a lot of controversy over what we were proposing on PEG channel capacity, and there was enough that we were hearing maybe from, elected officials and others that we were going to blow up the whole thing. Well, we don't want to do that, but what else can we pick off? And so it really is a lot like some of the state franchise laws that went after free cable service, went after iNets, but left PEG and in some form. So I see it more like it was just a sort of political, what can we get away with now, and what was like a little bit too hot to touch.
I'd actually suggest that it's the opposite of what you said. The order is very clear that the fact that you're using things for PEG or for programming is meaningless to the FCC.
Right.
That you need to choose. You either can get cash or you can get these things that you can't get whole. And I think it actually leads to the argument that you can do whatever you want with the money, but we're not going to give you special exceptions when you're using it for the positive things of PEG.
Right, on the big issue of, is it a franchise requirement and not a franchise fee or exaction, that we lost on. But so they moved the battle to what's the capital cost of PEG or not. And they couldn't decide on PEG capacity. So they said, we'll just keep it as it is.
Gail, let me ask you a question. Thanks. So it may not be as bad for PEG capacity. Of course, they punted that, right? So we don't know until they go down the road. For institutional networks, though, and I realize not everybody in this room has institutional networks, but some do, and they're very large networks, and they were even paid for by subscribers a long time ago through iNet fees, right? So they're out there. Some have just been renegotiated into maintenance agreements, right? This, though, would, let me make sure I'm following this. This, though, would allow the operator to come in, make a modification request, even if it was just signed, right, in a renewal, and say, okay, we agreed to a maintenance fee, but now we want you to pay market valuation for the use of that fiber, which might be like a dark fiber lease cost, plus any of the other costs that may have been negotiated differently. So do you think, I mean, that would be a huge impact. I mean, millions of dollars on jurisdictions that have institutional networks. So do you think that even with some of the lessening or some of the expansion in capital cost, do you think if the order comes out this way, do you think there will be litigation on this? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so they didn't, the expansion of capital costs does not help INETs, right?
Right.
Because that's only PEG capital costs. Yeah, well, I'll look when you're, yeah. But on the INETs, so to give you what happened in California, they lost INETs 10 years ago. There's still litigation or threats of litigation on INETs, because when you get into what they've really been composed of and who's paid for them and what services are being offered over them, they are like often like critical safety and emergency services are being transported, and it's a little bit of like you know, like a standoff, because the cable operator is like, we don't have to provide that, and the city is like, well, if you cut that, you're cutting the police service, right? So, you know, it's a dispute about money at the end of the day.
So INETs are no longer considered part of PEG fees. So if we're spending any of our PEG INET capital fee on INET related capital costs, then that amount could be set off against the franchise fee.
Yeah, so what they say is, costs associated with the construction, maintenance, and service of an INET fall within the 5% cap. Such costs are cable-related in-kind contributions. They meet the definition of a franchise fee. And then they go on and say, we disagree with LFA commenters who argue that the cost of INET should be excluded from the franchise fee. Although such comments contend that the Commission's proposal cannot be squared with the statute, it's entirely consistent with the statute to find that franchise authorities may impose cable-related requirements such as INETs on cable operators, but also to find that funding for these franchise requirements applies against a 5% cap. And they, somewhere in here, they also say it doesn't fall within the carve-out. The carve-out is limited exclusions for PEG-related costs and does not exclude INET-related costs.
So let me do a non-lawyer interpretation of what I think they said. Okay. I mean, I'll give it a try. So here's what I think I'm hearing. If you have funding that if you're using PEG funding separate from the franchise fee, and that PEG funding included the ability to use some of that for INET capital costs, that no longer can be considered separate from the franchise fee.
Right.
That it's essentially a part of the franchise fee. So if, however, now I'm going to make a leap here, so Gail hit me over the head. Okay. If, however, you choose to no longer use that portion of that 3% that's PEG INET for INET, and to use it for capital as defined under the order, then you would be using that money consistent with the order,
Right.
and therefore you would still have to figure out how you're going to pay for that INET stuff that you were paying for out of the 3%, but it wouldn't be, well, it could be subtracted from from your 5%, or you could find another source of revenue for it. Did that make sense? Okay.
Or if you put it another way, if you had a fee that was like a PEG/INET fee,
Yeah.
you can spend it on PEG and it's safe. You spend it on INET, it's not.
No.
And you said it's not retroactive, so
Is the money that they're talking about, the franchise fees that they're talking about now, is any payment made in the future? Or is it capital expenditures made in the future?
I don't know. They're talking about, well, let me go back
So we
and,
spend all our money.
right, because a lot of people have, yeah. Well, I think, yeah, before August 1st, put all those orders in. No, I'm trying to figure out, where, I'll look at that a little closer and see if they're, because they do, remember, you can continue to do whatever you're doing until they come in and, you know, yeah, seek a modification.
Yeah.
Right. Paragraph
Gail,
65, one
and that's
second.
even if the, yeah, let me use that one.
That might be one of those that falls under disagreements about which provisions of an existing franchise agreement are superseded, right? I mean, okay, so that's, let me talk a little bit about the mixed-use rule. And that one was like, I would just describe as we lost.
So, in our town, the town and the access corp split the capital payment, so the town will get 50% of the capital payment. Which they then will probably use in their network infrastructure. Is that what they're poo-pooing? Or does it not, is it more of a operating, is it like a maintenance fee that's written into the contract? Or are those two the same?
Okay, what state are you in?
Massachusetts.
That's what I thought. All right. So, here's what I understand, okay? I can do this. If the money you're talking about is part of what you might call a franchise fee, then you're fine. But if it's over and above the franchise fee, or the license fee, or whatever you might call it in your license agreement, okay, then it's a different story.
So the 4 or 5%.
That's fine. That's right. The capital grant over and above the franchise fee, whether it's 4 or 5%, okay, then that's what we're talking about with regard to how you can use that money, and that it must be used for PEG-related capital purposes as defined in the draft order. Okay, that's a separate question. No. No, he's in Massachusetts, and his situation is a little bit different than if you're not in Massachusetts. That's why I asked the Massachusetts question. Right, yeah, and okay, so that's why I asked the question about Massachusetts, because it is a little bit different. I mean, in Massachusetts, most of what we consider franchise fees is used for PEG-related purposes or INET-related purposes, but that's the 5% we're talking about, that is, it's not a separate amount over and above the 5%. Okay, so that's why I asked the question. Richard, I'm sorry if I confused it.
Yeah, no, that's right. So is anything above than the 5% is restricted to capital purposes or PEG-related equipment, not INET?
Well, so I would look at it a little differently and think of it as what counts towards the 5% and what doesn't, right? Because some things that you would have not counted towards 5% now have to count, and some things that maybe an operator would have argued were not excluded capital costs are now excluded capital costs. So you kind of just have to redo the math and see what side everything falls under. So just a few words on the mixed use, which will have a big impact on Pam, but others, so I would describe it as kind of a complete loss. So preempted franchise and other right-of-way use or other fees other than the 5% franchise fee for cable operators. And they also said you cannot regulate information services. And that applies the whole ruling applies in state video franchise states and in others that have local franchising. And the one question that raises for me is, any of you who are in states that have state video franchising laws know that they typically had two definitions. They had cable operator and they had video service provider. And the video service providers were the telephone companies that said we're not cable operators, AKA AT&T. So query how AT&T might benefit in a state that has state video franchising from a ruling interpreting the Cable Act that they say doesn't apply to them.
Question back here.
So, question, obviously, we're going through trying to finish the charter, which you mentioned last month. And the question, obviously, usually most franchises we've ever done, the franchise is deemed only for cable services, not giving them authority to other telecom services. And obviously, this goes to the heart of this. And I'm just thinking, we have other cities that we work with that are also now doing several wireline things with Verizon, et cetera, and we're thinking about the playing field. You come back to the charter. Now the government's going to say, or the FCC is going to say, you can't charge charter. So you can charge Verizon. You can say, well, sorry, charter's grandfathered in under cable.
That's exactly the problem.
Cable, right?
That's
So
exactly the problem.
not only is charter not going to pay on wireline and et cetera, but the amount they're paying for cable eventually is going to dwindle where they pay you nothing now. So you ever think this cable goes away, maybe eventually.
Right. And you will have that. You'll have the telecom providers saying, hey, you have to treat us all non-discriminatory. You're not charging this guy? How can you charge us? Yeah. Right, I think that was always their end game, yeah. And that was clear in the, even though they didn't drive the state video franchising, the adoption of the laws, they jumped on that bandwagon pretty quick, yeah.
Go.
Kind of things we're gonna talk about, big strategic things. I'm just tossing this out there. If you went in as a state, in the mixed use order, what they seem to be saying is, if you grant someone a franchise as a cable operator, you cannot require, they're specifically trying to say, we're gonna overturn the Eugene Court.
Right.
And that you can't say, well, I'm opposing these things to you, not as a cable operator, but it applies to everybody. It's sort of saying, once you get the cable franchise, and I'll limit what you have to do, and you get to do everything you want with that cable franchise, including offering non-cable services, if that's what Congress meant. So my question then is a radical idea is, what if you said in a state that we will abolish cable franchises altogether? No cable franchise is required for cable service, but instead you impose either a right-of-way fee or communications tax. So that I can say it just applies and it has nothing to do with franchising whatsoever. And I would also say that since the FCC seems to think that somehow it has this unlimited authority to say anything that's a franchise or the road, whether it's wireline, wireless, or cable, whether it's going to push more states to look at things like Virginia and Florida and learn from those examples of cutting out the loopholes and finding ways to effectively lobby so that at the state level you can get some of the money that goes to PEG and it doesn't just go to public safety and broadband in schools. Whether that is a way to address, it's kind of a nuclear option, but whether that's a way to, and it has a big risk because PEG really exists because of the protections of the Cable Act. And almost everybody's kind of lost at the municipal level in terms of trying to get elevated above the noise, particularly public access. Right. But I just tossed that out.
Well, yes, we've seen people trying to charge other telecom companies fees. How many years ago getting sued did they get asked for any more than 2 or 3%, and then having different jurisdictions, right? Have rulings where you have to do a cost based only. You're not going to get near the 5% kind of fee if you got a cable.
Right. So yeah, so that concept of like kind of trade off, okay, no more cable franchise, we just won't do that. We'll do a telecom franchise instead, and everybody pays, right? How that might work and the trade-offs there. So the cable operators always, a lot of them, the only authority they have to be in the public right-of-way is their cable franchise, right? Exactly. And so, and this just confirms that's the only one they need. So it would be interesting if they came for a renewal and you said, no thanks. We don't really, we'd rather you get a telecom franchise. But what you would lose are those things like the PEG protections and the PEG channel capacity. You might gain in fees, but that kind of calculation of would you benefit more, would you lose more, it's a pretty complicated one.
It's just like the market value issue.
Right.
maximum fee, you get the telecom side that says it has to be reasonable compensation, which is way less than 5%. You know, it's a lot.
But it's on a bigger base. So dollar-wise, it might be bigger. It all depends, and it depends on the state too, because in California it gets you nothing, because they have a state franchise for zero.
In some places you can't run internet either, so then you use some commercial services. So my other question was, what if we go to Verizon and we're doing a wireline with them? They say, wait a minute, we're going to pay a fee, the cable companies are paying a fee, then it might comment back, that's fine, maybe 5% cable fee, and you're in. If not, you're paying this fee because it's offset by the cable fee.
I'm not sure I followed. You have to say it again.
So we're businesses negotiate with Verizon for wireline. So Verizon says, well, we're not paying a fee because the cable company now doesn't have to pay a fee on wireline because of this ruling. You know, we just say back to Verizon, well, the day you pay me a 5% cable fee is the day that you get to claim that. If you're not doing a cable service, you're going to pay a wireline fee.
Dissimilar.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the argument they will make. Who knows how this would get resolved, right? But the argument they will make is you have to treat all the telecommunications service providers in a non-discriminatory way, and so you're discriminating somehow by not charging them. And your response would be, but we are charging them, we're just charging them on a different service, so we're trying to kind of equate it.
Yeah, Pam.
There could be litigation because in Oregon, Ohio.
It all leads to litigation.
So we do treat them different under the Federal Telecom Act than the other wireline. They have a different state law that addresses them. True, they have tried to come to us and say, or the other one say, treat us with the benefits of the island kids. And we say, you're not an island.
Right.
You might deliver a wireline service, but you don't deliver the local exchange island service. So you are dissimilar. They haven't sued us yet, but it doesn't mean they might not. They might.
Right.
So
That sounds a little bit like we're trying to say.
I think it is.
Right.
So give it a try. Tell them you are not similar
Right.
to this under the federal
Yeah, you're not
law.
offering three different services. You're only
Right.
Yeah,
offering
so
one.
it's fair and
Right.
reasonable to similar.
Right. So this just kind of points to the fact on the mixed-use rule, it goes back to what some of the conversation in the policy session yesterday, if you were there in the morning, kind of reopens this whole question of how should franchising or use of the public right-of-way, who should be paying to use the public right-of-way and how much, really, right? Because these different regimes came up in different ways, in different circumstances. Like to go back to the California example, public utilities there, telephone companies do not pay a franchise fee at all to use the public right-of-way, but that was developed when everyone thought they were basically regulated, the cost of their service and everything billed out. They had, provider of last resort, all these regulations on them, and so there would be almost no need to actually charge them, and because their rates are all regulated and everything too. Now that whole system is gone, right? We have a completely different competitive system. Everybody charged. We never have had rate regulation on wireless. Now wireless providers are using the right of way like crazy. So it's a whole different scenario than when these laws were all originally adopted. But we should I'm going to stop talking.
This is a perfect segue to Tom.
Yeah.
Talk about strategies from history. What have we learned, from history that can help us now?
Okay. Move all the way across? Okay, so I've got the mundane stuff, I think. But hopefully, and I guess at certain points I'm going to have to pause and look over at Gail and say, now can we still do this? Because I'm not sure. So one of the things we wanted to do today, besides go over the very hot report and order, is talk a little bit about what's been happening in franchise renewals in the last few years and some strategies you can use in negotiations and strategies that the operators are using and then how to respond to those. So one of the things, and we spent some time talking as a group earlier before the session, looking at some of the things that we'd all encountered. And one of the biggest things now is franchise negotiations just don't move quickly at all. They're end up with a lot of delays and roadblocks and even paralysis. And so how do you work around that? So what I did is in the handout, I put some of the common things that we've run into and then how to react to that. One of the big ones on the delay side is no authority at the local level. In other words, I have to run it back to corporate, run it back to, in the case of Comcast, take it back to Philadelphia. One of the things that happens sometimes, and I don't know whether this is strategic on the operator's part or whether you're literally running into situations where one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, is that sometimes they will agree at the local level, but, oh, we got to run it by corporate, but I don't think it's going to be a problem. Well, it is a problem, and you may have given something in negotiations in return for that thing that you're now not getting. One of the things that's really important is for you to sort of re-level the playing field. In other words, say, all right, well, if you can't do that, then we can't do this. Sometimes that will push them, and it also depends on who your local government affairs person is, and we found it effective in some cases to work through them, even if it's kind of working in a relationship that you've developed over a period of time, and say, listen, this is something we really need. You have to push this again. And sometimes it is effective, but don't let them play that issue of we got to run it up the flagpole, and it comes back down the flagpole, and it's no longer viable. Silos. Silos are a huge problem, and they're both real problems and problems that I think sometimes are just contrived. It results in delays. It results in stalling the process. So it's important to build that. That is a real problem. It's important to build that into your negotiations timeline. Usually, once you've completed all the pre-work, the community needs assessment, it's very important to sit down with your negotiating team and look at, what is the realistic timeline? What would we like to achieve? What do we think is going to be more realistic to achieve? And it usually is really important to start at the beginning of the 3-year window. Give yourself plenty of time to run into these kinds of things. And we'll talk a little bit more about silos farther down. Roadblocks. So in the case of roadblocks, just like delays where you can get them moving again, roadblocks, you can overcome them. Operators will always tell you they don't want to set precedents, right, unless they're in their favor. And it happens pretty much in every area of franchise negotiations. PEG funding, numbers of PEG channels, build-out requirements, density requirements related to build-out requirements, reporting requirements, number of them make up of courtesy accounts, although that I'm not sure what kind of roadblock that's going to be in the future. So one of the things that we found effective, because again, they'll say we don't want to set a precedent. Well, we'll say, but this is a precedent-setting situation. In other words, every franchise, it's not supposed to be cookie cutter. It's supposed to be based on the individual community's needs and their circumstances. And so continue to push that with them. And usually that will get you to the point where if you can actually help them say that it's a precedent in this particular case, but it can't be used in other cases, right, even though, that potentially it could, sometimes that helps sell it and helps you negotiate that particular item. Irrational reasons for denial. Okay, there's a lot of those out there. And the key is to bring that back to some rational state of negotiation. We get a lot of it can't be done. Well, maybe it couldn't be done in the past, but now it can. Technology is moving so rapidly. We'll talk in a second about some of the things that operators are doing related to upgrades. But it's moving really quickly. We had a case where Cox indicated to us that because of the regionalization of the PEG channels, and PEG channels were on the same channel, that they couldn't get their guide to function where they could actually put detailed listings, right? Well, later on in the discussion, we were talking about technology, and we were actually talking related to getting video. They said, oh, well, we're going to go to a switched digital video system. And I said, oh, well, a switched digital video system, doesn't that change your architecture? Oh, gosh, I guess it kind of does, right? So we got them into the point where once their architecture moves forward, they will phase in the guides, right? And originally it was, we can't do it. Once we got the right answer, got to the right people, and sort of moved it back around, now they're going to be able to do it. It'll be phased in as part of their whole upgrade to that type of technology.
And,
Yeah, go ahead.
Tom, I don't know, I'm sure you and Gail have experienced this, but I want to emphasize one of the things that points you just brought up is that a lot of times when you're in a negotiation, and if you do not have the decision makers at the table, they are just going to say pretty much no to everything you ask for, including things you already have in your existing franchise, okay? And you just simply need to be ready for that, okay? And your negotiating team, even when they figure out in advance kind of what their bottom line is, sometimes it's really easy to get to your bottom line faster than you should because you figured it out in advance and you know what it is. And your negotiating team may not realize it. As you said, this stuff can take a long time, 3 years. I mean, there's one negotiation that I know of that took 8 years, okay? And that was Salem, Oregon. And so, bottom line here is that I know that took 5 years, okay? So I just wanted to emphasize a couple of things that Tom pointed out because it really is a reality, okay? And you should just be ready for it. And I'll talk more about how to get ready for it when I do my little part, but I just want to emphasize your stuff.
Yeah, no, and it's a really good point, is the more preparation you have for this, the more that you will already anticipate certain things and know in a timeline, and then also know kind of the people that you have to bring in. And we also sort of push that back on the cable company. Sometimes we had a case where we were negotiating competitive equity language, and that one's always tricky because you don't want to tie it into something that could trip you up down the road. You do want to be fair and uniform. And this particular language that was floated by the cable company would have, essentially, if they believed that certain key items were no longer equitable based on a second franchisee coming in, they would be able to restart the whole process. In other words, it would redo the renewal window. And we said, no, we can't accept that. And they said, well, but we're doing this in all of our new franchises, right? And we said, no, you're not. And that was because we knew that they weren't. And so we actually asked them to bring in one of their attorneys who had negotiated another competitive equity clause, which was much more beneficial, really, to both sides. Okay, principal denial, but the principles are unfounded. Especially this is one on HD for PEG, and many of you run into this, and you can only get one channel, but I've got 4 channels, and oh, maybe you should put all the HD programming together from all these different PEG channels into one super, wonderful PEG channel. And it was essentially, again, that's one where your homework, doing your homework really helps, and networking with a lot of folks. Because what you'll find is that while that might be the starting point and that might be, quote, their principle, it's not where they end up. And we're always able to move beyond that. And a lot of it goes back and gets based on the needs assessment and what kind of needs you're able to demonstrate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We understand technology component compressing this is giving way less bandwidth than they ever gave us. It doesn't cost them anything. It doesn't matter. They just don't defeat it. They're just absolutely no. They're not going to do a darn thing.
Yeah. Just keep pushing.
I can't find evidence of anybody in this country that gets HD from Charter except maybe one government channel. Has anybody got anything?
There are a number of
Yeah.
I don't even know who that is. I need to throw that back out here.
Yeah, and that's a really...
Would anybody get all 6 of the big channels, or 3 of them even from Charter in HD?
Well, right in your neighbor, right here in Washington State, excuse me, not in Washington, Oregon, but never mind. Right off the top of my head, Richland and Pasco, Washington are Charter, and they have an HD channel. Not all their channels are HD, but those are the ones, that comes off the top of my head. There are other ones out there, so, but in order to keep us moving along here, but we'll catch it later, okay?
Okay, yeah, and that's a good point. Just networking in settings like this will give you a lot of information that'll be helpful in negotiations. Paralysis. Okay, so that's, you can overcome the roadblocks, you can sort of move through the delays. The paralysis is the biggest issue. It's like a war of attrition, essentially. And so when some of those things above, when you can't move off of them and you end up in gridlock, or what we've had in a couple of cases is where the operator will continue to push the LFA to do certain things and agree to certain things and give and give and give, but they don't get anything in return. And what you'll find is that elected officials sometimes tire of that process. I mean, it's been going on so long. Why has it been going on so long? Can't you get where you need to be? One of the things to do is like we were talking about before, is to, again, make sure that people know that there may be some deal breaker issues that you're going to hit, and then you've got to find a way to get beyond that paralysis. And I'll give you one that we got into and ultimately brought the chair of the Board of County Commissioners in, which was really helpful because he made it clear that he was more than willing to go in opposite directions, use a little leverage. There were infrastructure problems where we were giving them time to to fix those things, but they could have been subject to liquidated damages. I mean, whenever you get into a paralyzing situation, you got to find some way to break it. In this particular one, it was related to density clauses, and Comcast, this was Comcast, would not move off the density number. They said, we don't do that anywhere. Actually, right next door, they had 5 homes per mile lower, right? So, and we knew that, and so did the Board of County Commissioners. So what they did is they came in and they created something where it was not the same, so it didn't set this precedent for Comcast that they didn't want to set, but it was something new that they could point to and say, we negotiated this. And essentially what it was moving to a lower density, but only based on subscriber signups. And then you'll see that sometimes where it's based on the number of potential subscribers per mile that are willing to agree to a contract. So we were able to move that paralysis through by coming up with something novel that was acceptable to elected officials. It was also acceptable to the homeowners that were screaming to get cable service, although they obviously wanted broadband, and then moved that one forward, and it ultimately got approved. Okay. When the operator is waiting for federal or state relief, and of course, we've seen some paralysis recently. It'll be interesting to see if things move forward and how they move forward in some of these franchises once August 1st hits. Okay, I'm going to skip the FNPRM piece because Gail ran through that and gave us. I do have one question for you, though. One of the things related to many of the commenters, especially local governments, was that the FCC was moving to impair contracts that were negotiated, not requirements that were mandated, but negotiated. So running back to Julie's case, she's got, in her franchise, she's got agreements on how PEG and INET funds can be used. But what the commission is saying, I guess to avoid really the, at least the perception of impairing a contract, is that if the operator chooses, they can use the commission's guidance and they can go and they can go through a modification. In fact, if the LFA didn't approve the modification, there's no commission relief at that point. They actually have to go to state or federal court, right? Okay. All right. Yeah, go ahead.
Just for 1 second, because since we were talking about Julie and her franchise, so I looked up the question that you had asked, and in the sections that are talking about what would happen with existing franchise agreements, and the question was, well, what if I've got a big pot of money that I've already collected? How do I, does this order affect that? And the paragraph, if you look in paragraphs 63 through 65, it looks like it shouldn't at all. It should only apply, as they say a number of times, cable operators may count only ongoing and future in-kind contributions towards the 5% franchise fee cap after the order is effective. So in-kind contributions, not expenditures. So if you've collected money, it shouldn't be impacted. But of course, that doesn't mean some cable operator will read it differently.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, all right, so moving along, because we want to get to Sue. One of the things we wanted to talk to you about were some renewal outcomes, both some good ones and some difficult ones, but eventually got where we needed to be. HD carriage, and we talked about that before, and going back to some of the comments made, one of the things we found effective is to continue to debunk this whole, hey, bandwidth is tight and capacity is extremely valuable and we can't give you all these HD channels. The issue is, and you can read it in my handout, that based on where the industry is headed, it's becoming a smaller and smaller and smaller portion of capacity. Right now, an HD channel takes up 0.18% of a modern system, right? And going forward, it'll be even less than that. What most operators are doing to try to compete with the fiber to the premises folks is they're going to a technology called fiber deep, and fiber deep essentially pushes fiber deeper into the cable system, eliminates the amplifiers, and would only have coax from nodes. Comcast has embarked on a 7-year program to essentially do this for all of its systems. When they do that, they're going to go to 1.2 gigahertz, right? So they're going to increase their capacity by about 60%, and now that 0.18% becomes an ever-shrinking kind of thing. One of the things that we have found effective is if they continue to push on this, we don't have the capacity, and I guess so far they can't charge for it, right? But we'll find out in the third further notice of proposed rulemaking. Is one of the things we found effective is, remember, and Sue's going to talk about this, they have to be technically qualified to provide a renewed system, right? 10 years into the future, they're supposed to be able to provide cable service that would be modern cable service. So one of the things we found effective, if they, especially when the PEG demands are, okay, we've got one, we need one more, right? We've got one for the local government, we need one more for the schools, right? Push that whole issue about, well, maybe your system needs to be upgraded, right? And if it needs to be upgraded, then you don't have the technical qualifications to continue to operate. So you started to set the table for them that you might be willing, and maybe you're bluffing because it is expensive, but you might be willing to go into the formal process because this is so important to you, and your needs assessment demonstrates that without high definition capacity, the channels are lower viewed, they're not able to provide the quality of service that you want to provide. You have all HD equipment already, you're producing actually stuff in HD 4K, but you're looking for an HD channel. And that's been really effective. And once we sent them that letter that said that we want to start going down that road, we want you to make an upgrade proposal, they sent something back and said, okay, we'll give you the second HD channel. Yeah, exactly. Cross that one off. Okay. Migration to successor. Yeah, go ahead.
Just question about that. A couple of us have talked in Massachusetts about possibly getting our cities to work together to do this sort of thing, because we're all asking for basically the same thing.
To say, we might consider the formal process if you don't give us this, and just sort of mark a line there and say, okay, our needs assessment says we need this, and so we're not going to give up on this.
Right. There's
strategy that could work in terms of, you see that you're dealing with 5, not just one municipality, but 5.
Yeah, there's strength in numbers, absolutely. Yeah, you'll find that we've had some cases where actually, and so you've probably seen this too, where to get all of the franchise fees, some jurisdictions have broken out from commissions and consortia, and they have not fared well in their franchise negotiations as well as the commission members.
And in fact, it's a strategy that has been used particularly by Comcast in some states, and particularly I know in Minnesota, there's probably others, where there were a number of joint powers authorities that were organized way back when the original franchises were granted, and they were 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 communities. And when you hit renewal over the last 4 or 5 years, what happened was that the cable operators started to pick at and try to pick the jurisdictions off, okay? And because it weakened the overall resolve of the rest of the body, okay? So for those of you who are in that situation where you have a joint powers authority or whatever, and you're in renewal, be prepared, because this is simply a strategy that is being used, which goes to one of the things I want to talk about when I do my presentation here, is to talk about what you need to do in advance to help sort of, you know, put on the armor that for your elected officials and everybody that they need to have on so that they know what's coming and it doesn't come as a surprise and it can really come back at you and blow up things. So, anyway.
Mike had a comment.
Yeah.
First off, the in-kind part, I know this is from earlier on, but I think it ties in here when you're talking about as they expand the fiber close to the homes, which increases the bandwidth, which then reduces how much capacity on the system. Well, wouldn't that be a good argument then that the in-kind cost of the bandwidth of a channel, that every time they upgrade, is going to make it cheaper because it's taking less and less and less of the capacity on their system?
Yeah, I think definitely hang on to that one for the third further notice of proposed rulemaking, because at least right now they haven't. But yeah, that's a number of commenters raised that, and I think that's why the FCC says that it's a complex issue. That really, the way that these systems are going, and with IP transport and switch digital video, so it literally is just you request it and it's coming from a server and it's coming in bits, right? Exactly. So how do you value that? Is it the space that it takes up on the server? What is it? So yeah, I think hang on to that one, because and in fact, I make that point a little farther down, so I'll skip over it, that with all the changes in technology, capacity for HD or even HD 4K becomes a non-issue in the future. Migration to successor platforms, that's really important that you have at least some general language in there, that PEG will be able to go beyond HD as the system goes beyond HD. Some operators are willing to do that based on triggers. With Cox, we were able to get them to agree that once their system hit 50% or more in a successor format to HD, the PEG channels would automatically go to that new format, whatever it might be. And we didn't want to presuppose that it would be HD 4K because it may be, you know, years before that happens. So that's something that's important. Inclusion in the digital menu guide. I don't know, Gail, is that one of the in-kind services, or we'll have to check that.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean.
That was one of the things that was teed up.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a capacity issue. It's really sort of an operational cost, and most entities, you know. Right, and
Functionality issue.
and yeah.
In there, they spend a lot of time talking about necessary for the provision of cable service.
Yeah.
And you look at Comcast and the marketing and all the various things, so you might be able to make an argument that the ability for all those things, of your blinking eyes, your voice activated, all those guide functions, is necessary.
Right. That's a really good point. In fact, we've done some comparisons in studies that we've done, viewership numbers for channels that are long-standing, and compared these channels that were SD, not on the program guide, versus HD, now on the program guide. And in all of those cases, while it wasn't the same uniform number, all of their both awareness numbers and their viewership numbers increased, you know, some as much as 10%. So 10% on a system that has 300 channels is pretty good. Yeah. Okay, let me move along.
15 minutes.
Oh, gosh, all right. So let me just finish, because Sue's going to hit me if I don't. She may hit me anyway. All right, so let me just say one other thing, because you can read through the different strategies here. One thing that you definitely want to do is continue to make sure that you push for the things that you've had in the past, you know, the ability to get promotional support. Your hyper-local programming, you're beneficial to the company. They don't see it that way necessarily, but if you keep moving it back around, you can get those kinds of things. Access to VOD platforms, I guess VOD is some type of capacity that isn't, costed yet, but more and more viewing is shifting to non-real time. And if you have your programming up there, you will get viewed more. One of the other pieces is related to, back to the functionality issue, and I know you're going to talk about that, is that when you have the same functionality as other channels on the system, you will also be viewed more, and especially because remember, cable service itself is skewing older now. All the studies indicate that. Older folks don't watch a whole lot of VOD online. They watch it because they love that remote. They watch it on the cable system. Okay, that's it, and I will turn it over to Sue.
So I have an outline out there. It's a one-pager front and back, and I'll just try to zip through some of the stuff, and if you've got questions, I'll try to keep them moving along, but I do want to make sure you get your questions answered. So some of the things I'm going to talk about, I'm going to sort of shorten up, but on the front end of what I want to share with you is how do you prepare your franchising authorities and your city staff or county staff or town staff to be ready for what is going to happen to them when franchise renewal starts, and also when they sit down at the negotiating table. One of the things I found all too frequently, particularly in smaller communities, is that people they don't start the renewal process till, 6 months before the franchise is to be renewed. And I cannot tell you how many times I've seen that happen over and over again, particularly in smaller communities. So, and I'm going to speak to this now from the standpoint of you're a community media center organization, a nonprofit, a 501c3 in your community, you're running the access channels, and you must be monitoring the expiration date of your franchise or franchises, because in a number of states we deal with, there's maybe Verizon and Comcast, or Verizon and Charter, or Charter and RCN and Verizon. Watch them all. Sometimes they don't all come up at the same time. So you've really got to be preparing yourself as the local organization that runs the access channels to help your franchising authority be ready to go through renewal. Sometimes, if you're doing your job, you may know more about it than anybody at city or town hall, because your livelihood depends upon the stuff that's in that franchise agreement. So from the standpoint of then partnering and helping your franchising authority be ready for renewal, number one, make yourself smart about it, okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the key factors, but there's lots of things online on BB&K's website, on the Buskey Group's website, on CBG's website, about Spiegel McDermott's website, about what the franchise renewal process is. There's 1 or 2 or 3 pages you can go, you can look at, you can hand them out, okay? But be sure to go early. Don't wait till the 3-year window opens. Start before that. And also start before that in building good and positive relationships with your local government or franchising authority. Sometimes there's not a great working relationship. And if you may be 6 months or 6 years or 8 years from renewal and you get a real crappy relationship, now is the time to start to build or rebuild that relationship, because you really want it to be a good relationship when the time comes for renewal, or in the case of, depending on what happens with this order, the time comes for the cable operator coming in and wanting to modify the existing franchise, which provides some of the things that you are benefiting from as a community organization that's running the community access channels. So get smart about the renewal process, build good working relationships, start before the 3-year window opens. I would say work both with your elected officials and the key city staff or town staff that has responsibility for franchise renewal, and sometimes nobody at town hall or city hall even knows who's responsible for it, because there's no one that has in their job description cable franchise person, okay, or something to that effect. It's other duties as assigned whenever you have a few minutes, okay? And many times in smaller communities, that's exactly what it is. So again, that goes back to you guys becoming smart about it. If you are with a nonprofit who is running a community media center or a school, in the case of Rob, okay, where he's with an educational institution, you actually are in a perfect situation to educate your elected officials about it, because you might have a little bit more juice because you come from a college, okay? So figure out what your assets are from the standpoint of going in and making people recognize the importance of this process. Build a renewal leadership team. Now that may be the responsibility of the city or the county or the town in some places, but it sometimes may end up being the responsibility of the community organization, community access organization, or the PEG organization. One of the tricky things that I have found in some places is that the city or town doesn't want to start now. They go, oh, that's 3 years off. You need to find examples of places where this has taken a really long time. Find somebody at that city that will talk to your elected official or your city staff about, it took me 8 years in Salem, Oregon, okay? So it's okay to start 3 years out, okay? But sometimes it's going to take that kind of colleague kind of conversation before they'll take your recommendation seriously. I'm being very direct and blunt about some of this stuff because I think over the last too many years I've run into it too many times where best intended people at the Community Media Center are not taken seriously, okay? And I want to help you kind of jump that hurdle. It's the education process, building a renewal team, before the renewal process actually happens, doing a 2 or a 1 hour workshop where you invite, and maybe you invite somebody who's from a neighboring community who's done a great job with renewal, to come in and talk about what the renewal process is and why it's important. But you want to bring in key stakeholders from your community. You want to bring in the Chamber of Commerce, people who are leaders with nonprofit organizations in the community, the faith-based community, obviously key city staff, every elected official. This is a community meeting. You might want to get it co-sponsored by, I don't know, the city and the Chamber of Commerce, or in other words, it's the Access Corporation with these other collaborators, and they're coming together, and here's this informational session. It's not intended to step on the city's toes at all. It's just, hey, here's some information that might be valuable, okay? And that may be a way of starting to build a long-term collaboration process that will benefit you. One place where we did this, with the city council, the Access Corporation in many places that I've dealt with in the past has ended up paying for the needs assessment, which I'll get to in a second. And if that is the case, if the Access Corporation, the Community Media Center budgets to pay for a community needs assessment, then it'd be a really cool idea to get the city to pass a resolution officially designating that needs assessment process as the official part of the city's franchise renewal process. We did this in Missoula, Montana. It wasn't hard. The council was very, very supportive of it. But what it did was help later on for the folks who are going to be negotiating the franchise. If the cable operator said, well, that was the Access Corporation's needs assessment, and they just wanted to put everything in there they wanted, and the city says, no, we endorse that. It is officially our needs assessment process. So that's something to keep in mind, particularly, again, in some communities where the city may not want to budget for a needs assessment process. You've done it as the nonprofit. Get a resolution that makes that an official part of the process that the city's going through. So now kind of diving into a couple of other things. Your homework and the importance of compliance review and needs assessment and creating leverage. In renewal, and this is on the back side of my handout, essentially if you get into the formal process, there's only 4 reasons you can say no, I won't renew your franchise. And you have to have a negative finding in at least one of them, but it's sure handy to have it in more than one of them, okay? And that is, number 1, if the quality of the operator's service has been particularly poor, and you can prove it. The company does not have the financial, technical, remember what we were just talking about a few minutes ago, or legal qualifications to operate a cable system. If they have failed to comply with substantial terms and conditions of the existing franchise agreement, and if the proposal they submit fails to meet the identified community needs and interests, those that have been identified by the city and the community in the needs assessment process. So if you want to build leverage going into renewal, you need to do your homework very thoroughly on the compliance review side and on the needs assessment side, because that is where your tools in your negotiating tool belt are going to be. They're going to be from the findings from those 2 pieces of the process, okay? So let's talk about then what's involved in compliance auditing and in a franchise fee, in a needs assessment process. One other thing I want to mention, and I'm going to swing back to a point I made a little bit earlier, and that is that the needs assessment process, which some think, well, we have to do for renewal, has dual purposes. A needs assessment process is also the foundation for developing a strategic plan. So what I've seen in a lot of places is the Access Corporation, because the city was not going to do a needs assessment, okay, but the city said, fine, you Access Corporation, do it. You can use the findings out of that needs assessment process to build a strategic plan. Now, I'm going to circle back to that at the end, okay? So let's take a look at the compliance auditing first. Again, this is about building leverage, okay, so that whoever's negotiating the franchise is going to go in and have the tools that they need to get the best outcome for your community. Now, this is the piece that for the Access Corporation gets a little harder at a certain level. The issue of doing a compliance audit, taking the existing contract and going, okay, these are the obligations, yes or no. They did it or they didn't do it. Now, sometimes, if nobody's looked at it in the last 10 or 15 years, it's pretty hard to determine whether they did or didn't do it. Okay. Other things are a little, if you look at other things, it might be a little easier to determine whether they did or did not do it. For example, maybe they were supposed to put a dedicated two-way cable drop into the library, but they never did it, okay? Now, the question is, did the city ask for it or not, okay? And if the city didn't ask for it, did the city ask for something else? In other words, so you've got to go through, and that's a process that really needs to involve local government staff, and if the city is engaged an attorney to assist it with its process, that the attorney, or maybe the city's attorney, okay? It is, and also sometimes, not always, if you have a city auditor or finance director who's used to kind of dealing with looking at yes, no, you as the person with knowledge of cable, and they as the person of knowledge about how to do an audit just structurally, can be useful. So I'm trying to throw things out here that are going to apply both to very small communities and to very large communities, larger communities in the renewal process. There's a lot of ways of getting to this, but the compliance audit becomes really key. One of the things that I've found in my experience is having a combination of non-compliance issues, even if sometimes they don't seem like they're big ones, still having them, and if they're true non-compliance issues, and having stuff from your needs assessment process becomes absolutely critical in coming out the other end of the negotiation where you would ideally like to, or even, which would be acceptable to come out the other end. Rarely do we get where we ideally want to go. I'll give you that heads up. So another piece is a franchise fee audit. We started to dive into this in some of the other workshops already, but it's essentially determining whether the cable operators paid the proper amount of franchise fees. Now, there may be a statute of limitations either in your existing franchise agreement or in state law that you're going to have to deal with, but that again is something that really, in the perfect world, the city needs to retain a financial expert who is expert in that particular arena in doing cable franchise fee and PEG fee audits. It's a little bit difficult for somebody who's just a finance director in a community to do this. There's a lot of things that you have to kind of know what to look for and where to look for it. And there are a number of people who are really good at that kind of work who are around it and working and assisting local governments. So franchise fee audit, a compliance review, a technical review. This goes to the part that Tom was talking about, having a qualified engineer come in and look at the plant, determining what the functionality and capacity is of the plant is right now. Your public works people or your public utilities people in your community may be very useful on this, particularly when it comes to drops that don't meet National Electrical Safety Code sort of situations. So again, look, this is something where you may have people within City Hall, the utilities folks, who may know, they are familiar with National Electrical Safety Code, electrical code. They may be able to tell you, we have a problem over here and a problem over there, go take the pictures, okay? So there are also engineering firms that help out with this, but these are all the pieces that might go into a compliance review. And then information that comes out of the needs assessment process, which has to do with past performance of the cable operator, also pulls into this compliance auditing. Now let me go to the needs assessment piece. I'm talking fast, so if bear with me and give me 5 or 10 extra minutes, I hope I can get you to the end of this. Okay, when you're doing a needs assessment, you need to gather information using a number of tools. You need to do, ideally, number one, the education piece up front, okay? Doing community focus groups or stakeholder meetings, I think, is extremely helpful and valuable. Doing an online survey, okay? And you get different information off an online survey than you get off focus groups. And so you really need to do both. The other thing that I strongly suggest is making sure when you're in a needs assessment process, you make the tent, as far as getting input, as large as possible. Don't just have it be the usual suspects, so to speak, okay? You really need to do outreach to make sure that people in the community know why this is important. You need to make sure that they know why their input will be critical to something that can benefit them or their organization or their city or town department specifically. Once they recognize why it is important to them today or tomorrow to provide input, it's going to be much easier to get them to come to a focus group meeting or to participate in an online survey. The other thing that I find is very helpful when we're doing these needs assessment processes is to get go to community organizations, institutions, agencies. Do they have an existing strategic plan? Do they have an existing telecommunications or communications plan? Look at those, because in those plans, many times you can extract things that directly relate to a community cable-related need or interest for that college, or for that school district, or for that community organization, or for that library, or whatever. The more information you have from a multitude of sources, you create a larger database of information that then can create a justification for what you might think is important to be required in the renewed franchise. Telephone surveys, I don't see done as much as they used to be. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I won't dive too deeply into them, but the biggest one is, I don't know about you, but there's a lot of people who abandon their landline phones completely, and they only have cell phones. And I'm sorry, I don't like to get a cell phone survey when I'm out at the grocery store or walking my dog, okay? And so just getting people to respond to telephone surveying is much more difficult than it used to be. So that's why we don't see telephone surveys used as much as they used to be sort of the gold standard, and they're just not so much, not as much as they used to be at least anymore. Looking at the existing current PEG resources, the equipment and facilities that are in place, whether you're a PEG under one roof or you're separate P, E, and G, the condition of the equipment, the amount the equipment is being used now, okay? Making sure that you get input from folks who are users of the community media center or the public access channels and that equipment. All of that, in other words, an evaluation of the current PEG-related both hardware, software, and services becomes very important. Because many times we find that we're not meeting, once we gather this data, we're not meeting current needs, let alone future needs, okay? And a good example of that is one place that we recently worked. Well, the Access Corporation had taken out a loan to do a renovation of their facility, and now they're in renewal, and they owe $200,000, and they're going to be paying X amount of dollars a month for the renovation of that facility. Well, we looked at that and said, well, in renewal, we really need to pull that in. It's identified need, okay? So you see how all of these pieces begin to, hopefully, you can see how they all begin to fit together. Because out the other end of this, you want to have a report, and that report, you'll want to document what you found, what the everything you found, what the key findings are, what the recommendations are, and the recommendations each need to be connected to a key finding, okay? So by presenting the data in that manner, whoever is negotiating the franchise, when they say we need 3 HD channels, they will also have 5 bullet points that came out of the needs assessment process that shows a negotiator, because the negotiator may not be the person who did the needs assessment process. You've got to make it easy for the negotiators to have the data they need to justify what they're about to ask for. So that's a very quick overview, I hope, of the needs assessment process. Now, kind of as you begin then to take that data, whether you're the city or the Access Corporation taking it to the city, the key here is to have been building buy-in. That was not good English. Build a buy-in all along the way. In other words, keep and engage your city officials, in the process all along the way, particularly if this is being done by the nonprofit and not by the local government. And even if it's being done by the local government, city staff needs to keep their supervisors engaged. There's too many times that I've identified places where a really, I think, good needs assessment was done, but because the guys or gals at the top didn't pay much attention to what was going on at the lower level staff level, when it came to negotiate, there was this giant information gap between the data that was actually there and what the negotiators were going to do at the negotiating table. So this goes back to some of the early things I was saying in my presentation, which is you've got to keep the key players involved and engaged from before the process begins till it's all the way done. And if you don't, a misstep can really mess things up, okay? So with that, one other quick kind of circle back, and that is the data you get from the needs assessment is when you're doing a strategic planning process, one of the things you need to do is what we call an environmental scan. You heard some of these similar words this morning from the folks who were doing that opening presentation. The bottom line is this data that comes in from the needs assessment process is essentially a community environmental scan, okay? You can use that to help you as an organization, if you're a nonprofit or a city department or a college or whatever, to figure out where we ought to be going with our services in the future, okay? So don't forget that once this needs assessment is done, you've got a wealth of very valuable information that then can be used on an ongoing basis in a strategic plan or just an annual planning process for that matter. So that's kind of, I don't know if anybody has any questions, but that was like a quick brain dump, okay? I tried. Okay, lots of questions. Go.
If, in terms of the gases, if they are not living up to something they said in the contract, for example, that they are a public forum and they went to court saying they weren't a public forum, how will that be perceived? And is that something that would be taken into account?
It could hurt the community. Because, frankly, I mean, I'm being direct, okay? I mean, the key is, number one, who's it a contractual relationship with? I mean, in most places, a contract to run the Access Center is between the local government and the 501c3. In other places, in a few places, it's between the cable operator and the 501c3, which is the case in New York City, okay, which is very different than most places around the country. But the bottom line is, frankly, territorial battles, you do not want them going on in the renewal process. Right. You do not want to start pointing at the Access Corporation and saying, you are crappy, you are bad, you've done a bad job. That will come back and stab the community in the back because the cable operator will go, okay, they don't like it, so why should I give them money or resources or channels? You need to be keep turf battles out of this process. It can really backfire. Has some questions back here?
Reflecting on the data of the survey, do we have to make that kind of raw data available to the cable companies and discover? Because I know they're very limited in how much of their data they like to share with us.
Well, you guys, you want to go for it, Gail.
Yeah, that's kind of a tricky question because you want to rely on it, but you also don't want sometimes you don't want to have it out there being used against you in some way or something. And so we tend to it's a little bit of a balancing act. Sometimes by the time we get involved as attorneys, they've already done a needs assessment and they've published it. So there's no no going back. Once it's out, it's out. Sometimes what we recommend is that as you're working, and especially when you think of how long these negotiations can take, that you do a needs assessment, but you don't finalize it. So it's a draft. And you may want to be updating it as you go along, as the years go on and you're still negotiating and, now there's something other than 4K or whatever, right? So that's one of the ways where you can kind of keep it close to your vest, but still know that it's there if you need to, if you do find yourself in a situation where you're moving to like a formal renewal process and you want to finalize it and rely on it in that process.
I think we're good.
See, you got it all.
I could talk really fast, but I.